means is like pretty much what that means is like the king, you can see white's king is very far advanced up the board, whereas black's king is still on the back rank. And as you'll see, white's king actually has a lot more mobility. White's king can go to a lot more squares, whereas black's king only has these 2 squares to work with, which is why king activities are important, because then you have a lot more possibilities, a lot more options for your king to go to. And your king in the endgame is very important because all of the, I guess, firepower from all the pieces are mostly traded off. So your king is like free to move forwards without getting checkmated or attacked in any sense. So for example, in this position, just to demonstrate how useful this king being really active is, this king will sort of shield the opponent's king so that the opponent's king can't get off the back rank, as you saw with the arrows. Because the kings can't be beside each other, this king isn't able to step forwards because all 3 squares are covered by our own king. And so it can only slide back and forth, and then we just continue to shield it. And then you'll see that here, eventually, these 3 pawns that black has, these 3 pawns are all going to fall because black's king is so passive, there's no way to defend these pawns. And so you'll soon see we're able to win these pawns. Black king finally gets active, but it's a bit too late. We're simply able to pretty much push this pawn through. Just to demonstrate, here we can do something like this, get a queen, and this is easily winning. So this is an example of, I guess, king activity, one side getting their king active in an endgame, and how it can actually be really useful. As you'll see here, even though white is down a rook for a bishop, but here you'll see the power of king activity in an endgame. Even though white is down a rook for a bishop, once the king gets active, that matters less because we have pawns at the end of the day, and the pawns are what's going to become a queen or have our opponent sacrifice back material. So for example, you'll see here, white slowly marches their king up while black tries to focus on getting a pawn here that can become a queen. And here, so here the idea for white now after they move king to g6 is to sort of play f6, and then f7, and then put the bishop on f4. So just to show, if let's say black plays some random moves, you'll see this pawn has already gotten to the f7 square, and it's 1 square away from queening. However, we can't promote it right now because then there'd simply be rook takes on f8, and then we would probably be losing. Well, most likely we are losing. So we block the rook's line of sight to this pawn by playing the move bishop f5. So this cuts off the circulation of the rook to the pawn. And then now let's say, well, now black has no way to stop this pawn. Let's say black plays a random move. Then here we can queen, and this is actually checkmate. In fact, all of these squares are covered. So that's the threat in the position. However, black themselves, they continue with the plan of trying to get a queen, pretty much, trying to get their pawn to promote. And here, as black, we can't actually take this pawn. The reason being, then there's simply the bishop takes on b3, and this pawn is going to fall soon. And then we do have 3 pawns for white, and that's pretty much like 3 chances to get new queens or promote to another piece. So here, black plays the move a3. And now black's pawn is still 2 squares away from queening. However, the bishop can't take it immediately. So here white plays the move b4 so that this bishop now can protect the a2 square. So here if a2, there's simply bishop takes a2, and now it's even worse. Now white has 4 pawns. This pawn's going to fall. And that's pretty much 4 chances for white to make a queen or promote a piece. So here, black plays the move rook to e1. And the idea with rook to e1 is very simple. We're planning on taking this bishop, and then afterwards we're able to push a2. Here, white plays b5, and here black takes on e6. So just to demonstrate, like here, if white plays the move king f6, then there is rook takes on e6 with check. And then let's say f captures on e6, then there's a2, and this bishop is no longer here, so it can't actually capture the pawn on a2. And then this pawn will be able to queen first, and this is with check, so we can't actually play e8 equals queen because we're in check. So after king f7, there are ways to stop the pawn from promoting by giving a series of checks. So going back, however, here the player with white had calculated correctly, and I noticed that this move isn't actually a threat. Black still played it anyway, because here both sides, and this is actually where the king being really active comes into play. You'll see that this king is completely boxed in by this king, controlling the g7 and h7 squares. So now after e7, even if black gets to promote, this doesn't come with check because the king is still on g6. And now after white promotes, you'll see that this is actually checkmate. Again, the king being really active, it does lock the king on the back, lock the opponent's king on the back rank. So g7, h7 are covered, and then obviously these back rank squares are covered by the queen. So this is an example of how king activity is very useful. Even though white in the starting position was down a rook for a bishop, white managed to get their king really active and create many threats of getting the f pawn through to become a queen. So basically black can hold the pressure, and then they unfortunately blundered and it led to checkmate. So that's why getting your king active is very useful in endgames. Okay. So now we'll go on to like the common themes or things that are very useful in endgames to do. So there's 5 of them. First one we have is opposition, and the second one is Zugzwang. So we'll kind of cover them together. So opposition is kind of when we have our, there's a lot of arrows here. So when we have our opponent kind of shielded in a sense. So for example, here, this is white to play. So in this scenario, even though black is down a pawn, this is actually a draw. Although it might look like white is able to win because they do have this pawn that can maybe become a queen. Black here, it's black to move. So black actually has opposition here. So opposition is pretty much when we're able to shield our opponent's king from sort of making progress and entering into our position. So here, for example, for black, I'll flip the board to make it easier. So here, so it's white to move. So white moves their king to c5. They're trying to maybe like make progress by entering into black's position and pushing this pawn. However, here, black can simply play the move king c7 to shield white's king away from entering the 6th rank. As we know, kings can't be beside each other. So let's say white comes back. The idea is now to play king a6, and then king a7, and then like accompany it with b5, b6 to try to get a queen. So for example, if black isn't careful, then something like this could arise. And this is similar to the example we'll cover next. But here, black tries to stop white from getting into the 7th rank now. But it's black to move, so black has to concede either c7 or a7. So let's say king a8, then now white gets king c7 and is able to push this pawn through. So here, since we shield the king, obviously king b5 is possible, but here we can simply come back with king b7, and we've already seen this position once. So if this position happens another time, then this would be a draw. So instead, white tries to push their pawn forwards. At the end of the day, white does have an extra pawn, so they're trying to queen it. But here we can come back king b7, and then here, if white steps back or steps somewhere else with the king, then we can simply step forward with the king to b6 and either attack this pawn or sort of have white kind of like concede something else. Like let's say king c4, king b6, king b4, then you'll see that this king is now behind the pawn. So basically black's king is getting active and it's sort of limiting the options that white has for movement. So let's say white tries b6, and then here king b8. It's important we don't play king c8, which we'll get into in a second. So king b8, now we can't play b7 because then we can simply take. So here, let's say white plays king c6. And this is why king b8 is really important, because now we can play king c8 to again shield the king from entering into the 7th rank, which is why king c8 here would actually be a blunder, because here, if white plays king to c6, you see that this is sort of similar to the scenario where the where white's king was on b6 and black's king was on b8 in this scenario. So basically, sorry about that. Pretty much right here, since it's black to move, black has to concede either d7 or b7. So let's say king to b8. Okay, well, I guess here we firstly play the move b7 because king d7, then black would play king b7 and we lose this pawn. But here we play b7 to prevent black from coming back to c8 to shield white's king. So now black's only move is king a7. And here you'll see that the c7 square is now conceded, so we can play king c7 and support the pawn promotion. And if you go king to d8, then we'll play king b7. We're shielding the king away, as you can see. This forms like a nice wall here. And black's king cannot come back to stop this pawn from promoting. So let's say king b7. Then here we can play king a7, king a8, both work. Let's say king a7. Here, black does get king back to c8, but here we can simply play b7. And pretty much black is forced to concede, and we're able to promote to a queen. Okay, and then so here we go back. So here, that's why here we play king c8 to stop white from being able to get into the 7th rank. And then here, if we play b7, then king b8 to stop promotion. And here, the only move to protect the pawn is to play king to b6. And at this point, this would be stalemate. The king covers these two squares as well as b7, and c8 and a8 are both covered by the pawn. Obviously, you can't pass a move in chess, so this would indeed be stalemate. And there's no way to make progress here because black would always be able to give opposition, which is not allowing your opponent to sort of make progress into your position. What's funny about endgames also is that, so if the same position that we saw earlier here, so in this same position, I'll flip the board back again. So here it is white to move. However, in this position, same position, but here if it's black to move, then black would actually be losing. The reason is because the black king currently obviously protects white from getting into a6 or c6, but since it's black to move, black has to concede one of these two squares by moving their king. Say king c7, then we play king a6, and then we can support this pawn to become a queen. If you go the other way, then same thing. We just obviously take the square that the king has conceded, and then we're able to push this pawn through, accompanied by the king. So just to show a variation. And here it's very important that we don't keep pushing our pawn forward, because this b6 would actually be stalemate. The pawn controls a7, and both the b7 and b8 squares are both controlled by our king. So here, after this position, instead of playing b6, we come back, king to b8, king to b6, sorry. And after king to b8, here, this is a little bit of technique, but after king a6, king a8, here, you'll realize that we're able to sort of force the king out from b8. And then after king to c7, we play king a7 to control the b8 square, and we're able to get a queen next move. Okay, and that also covers zugzwang as well. Pretty much in this position, I'll go back. This position for black is kind of zugzwang. The reason is being, so zugzwang, zugzwang is kind of like, it's a term in chess which refers to like a position where your opponent, whatever move they play, their position would get worse. So for example, in this scenario, it would be zugzwang because pretty much any move black makes, black has to concede either c6 or a6. As we've mentioned, king a7, then obviously white gets the c6 square. If you go king to c7, then white gets the a7 square, and we're able to push the pawn forward. And obviously, if we move backwards, then we can play like king b6, for example, and we're just getting even closer to getting a queen. So this is sort of how zugzwang works. It's like any move your opponent makes, it makes their position worse in some way. Okay, this is another example of like opposition or zugzwang. So here, black to move. Black has no good moves here. Firstly, this pawn can't move. It's blocked by this pawn. And the best move here for black is to play king f8. If black plays, let's say, king to d7, then here we play f6. Reason being, we want to play f7, f8, or take this pawn and then play g8 equals queen. If you take this pawn, then we play king takes on f6. And here, after king e8, we're able to shield the king away from getting to the f file by playing g7. This shields the king away, and the king isn't able to get in, and then we're able to play g8 queen. If king d8, pretty much the same thing. Here the king is even farther away. And then if king e8, then here we play king to d6. Our idea is to go king c7 or king d7, and then slowly march our king over, and then win this pawn or push f6. So just to demonstrate, so obviously here, if you try to get opposition, here we have pawns, so we can play f6. does look like it gives away a pawn, but our pawn is a lot closer to becoming a queen, whereas black's pawn still has a long ways to go. So here, for example, here rook or queen doesn't really matter. This is actually checkmate. And here, after king to d6, if you play king to f8, then here we can play king d7. As I mentioned with our plan, we're going to play king e7, king f7. And here it's important we don't play king f7. This is something common in endgames. We don't want to get our opponent in stalemate because our king on f7 controls g8 and the pawn on g6 controls h7. So here instead we play the move f6 so that the king still has the g7 square, g8 square, sorry. And here there's a couple of ways to win. We can play like g7, for example, and after king h8, rook or queen doesn't matter again. This pawn does stop the king from going to h7. So now we go back. So here, if black plays king to f8, then here we march forward, king e6. After all, black here is also in Zugzwang. Any move he plays, it leads to pretty much us getting a queen in a couple of moves. So king f8, it concedes the e6 square. King to e6. King to e8, trying to get opposition and stopping our plan of going king d7, king to e7, and then f7 and taking the pawn. But here we can play king to d6. We're kind of like outflanking our opponent's king. If they continue to follow us, stopping us from getting into the 7th rank, here we can play f6. The idea is takes and then push to g8 to become a queen, or f7, f8. And if you take, once again, our pawn is 2 squares away from queening. Our opponent is 5 squares away. 5 squares away. So here we would be able to get a queen and do checkmate, or rook, same thing. So that's sort of how opposition in Zugzwang works. So the next thing in endgames that's really important is our pawn structure. So pawn structure is a very important element of endgames. It references sort of how our pawns look and whether or not they're supported or like well supported, or if they're protected with each other. So there's a couple of different pawn structures. So for example, this is something called doubled pawns because there's 2 pawns on the same file pretty much. So this is called doubled pawns. Doubled pawns sometimes could be useful, but most of the time they aren't as great as having singular pawns on each file because we sort of don't want our pawns to be in the way of each other per se. We want them to have the most mobility possible. Another type of pawns is isolated pawns. So this is, for example, for black, an isolated pawn, because this pawn pretty much is by itself. There's no sort of pawns that are beside it that can help support it. So for example, if we attack it with our king, it can only move forwards. There are no other pawns that can help support it. And this also brings in another concept of endgames, which is also like pawn islands. Pretty much a pawn island is like a group of pawns that are together. So for example, this is a pawn island. There's 3 pawns here. They're all together. That's one pawn island. And black has a second pawn island, which is this singular pawn by itself. And you'll see that white has a singular pawn island here. And usually you prefer to have as small amount of pawn islands as possible because you want all your pawns to be connected and together as well as protected. Okay. And here, just to combine the first 2 types of pawn structures, here's an example of isolated doubled pawns pretty much when there are no pawns on adjacent files to these pawns, and then they are also doubled at the same time. And this also shows sort of how pawn structure is very important. Here in this position, the computer actually evaluates this as completely winning for white, even though it looks like both sides have the same amount of pawns. You'll see that due to the horrible quality of these pawns that black has, this is completely winning for white because these pawns are really difficult to defend. Okay, and finally, this is an example of just like good pawn structure for both sides where there's no sort of major problems. All of these pawns are on their own file that grants them the most mobility possible. And this should probably be a draw. Okay, and the next theme or concept we have for endgames is rook on the 7th rank. So the rook on the 7th rank is very useful because going back to the endgame principle I talked about earlier, where we want to cut off our opponent's king. This is very useful because, so in this position, rook d7 is the rook on the 7th. Because if we envision a scenario here where all these pawns have moved forwards, you'll see that this king is now cut off by this rook. So this king can only sort of operate on the back rank, and that's not useful because in an endgame, we want our king to move forwards because there are no other pieces left, so the king won't get checkmated. So you want the king to be active in order to help support our other pawns. So a rook on the 7th is very useful to cut off our opponent's king. And also a rook on the 7th is kind of just a general term. So we can have 2 rooks on the 7th. A queen on the 7th also works as well. And in some very good cases, we have both rooks and the queen on the 7th, which usually leads to checkmate. So a rook on the 7th is really good to cut off our opponent's king. Here is another example. This is an example where we have both rooks on the 7th rank, which is very useful because here you see all these pawns are really weak. And it will be very easy to sort of pick off a lot of the pawns because keep in mind, the pawns, technically speaking, do start on our opponent's 7th rank, or our opponent's pawns do start on the opponent's 7th rank. So this is just like a real game example of the pawns on the 7th rank. So here, white plays the rook move, rook takes g6. It does look like it sacrifices a rook. But here we have rook to g8, rook to g1, and then king f7, then there's queen g6 checkmate. Going back, however, here black plays king f7, and here we get our rook to g7 check, and you'll see that the rook is now in the 7th rank, and it can hit at a lot of pieces here. King to e8, and now queen takes e6, and this rook teams up with this queen. This queen pins this bishop to the king, and this rook is also attacking the bishop, so the bishop's going to be lost. And here, again, we're exerting the power of this rook on g7 on the 7th rank. It is also pinning the king through the knight. So here we can play queen takes f8. You can't actually take the queen because then there's rook takes king. So this is sort of to demonstrate the power of the rook on the 7th rank. It can help us win a lot of pieces. It can help us win pawns, and it's in general very useful. Okay. And then the final, I guess, concept we have is pass pawns. So pass pawns are pretty much, I mentioned this before, pass pawns are pawns that cannot be stopped by an enemy pawn in any way. Basically, for example, in this position, this is a pass pawn. The reason this is a pass pawn is because black has no pawns on the adjacent files. I'll get rid of some of the arrows. Black has no pawns on the adjacent files, so there's no way for black to capture this pawn at any point when this pawn goes up the board. And there are no pawns on this file as well. There are no pawns on this file to, well, we'll say like blockade this pawn. So for example, we'll make some random moves. For example, this isn't a pass pawn because it can get blockaded by this pawn, so it doesn't have free mobility to march all the way to the 8th rank. And this pawn also isn't passed, although there is no pawn blockading it in at the moment. This pawn on b7, sorry, it can capture this pawn if obviously white makes some random moves and like has to trade the pawns or gives it away for some reason. Then this pawn does have the option to obviously take this pawn at some point. So this pawn isn't passed as well. However, this pawn, as we mentioned, there are no pawns here or here on the e file or g file to capture this pawn. And there's no pawns on the f file in order to blockade it. So this would be a pass pawn. So pass pawns are very useful in general because you can only stop it with pieces or with your king. So it's always a constant threat that our opponent has to deal with because pretty much the pawn is able to queen if no one tries to go, if our opponent doesn't try to stop it. And obviously a queen in endgames is very useful because sort of the board is all opened up now. There's less pieces. So it's very easy for our queen to have a lot of mobility. Okay. And then the final thing we'll look at is pawn breakthroughs. So pawn breakthroughs in endgames are very crucial. So what a pawn breakthrough is pretty much when we're using our pawns in order to sort of open up files for one of our pawns, for example, in this case, to become a queen. So we use pawn breakthroughs often, not necessarily only in endgames, but also in other phases of the game. But in endgames, it's really useful in order to sort of break a pawn and allow it to kind of get through to promote to become a queen. And as I mentioned, obviously in endgames, the power of a queen is a lot more amplified because all the squares are now opened up and the queen has a lot of mobility. So for example, in this position, white is winning here with the move b6. So here the pawn on b6 is engaging 2 different pawns. And here, obviously, if we play some random move the king, we can play b takes a7, and our pawn has broken through our enemy's pawn, like our enemy's lines pretty much, our enemy's pawns, and then we're able to play a8 equals queen. So here, let's look at what happens if let's say c takes b6 to get rid of this pawn. Then here we play the move a6. Although it does look like we're giving away a pawn here on a6 or this pawn on c5, this is winning for white, because if you play b takes on a6, you'll see that we sacrifice both of those pawns, but this pawn no longer has any way to be stopped by black's position. This king is too far away. It cannot stop this pawn. And after the move c6, black can try to push their pawn forward, but this is as far as they're going to get, because our queen's going to give a bunch of checks and pick up the 3 pawns. Going back, here after takes and a6, if you b takes c5, then here we can take this pawn on b7, and we're able to play ba equals queen. And similar story, if you play a takes b6, here instead of playing the move a6, because a6, then this pawn is stopped by the pawn on c7. Here we play the move c6. It's kind of just like flipped, a mirror image of the position we had earlier. If you take this pawn, we take on b7, we're pushing on through. And if you take on c6, then here we play a6. This pawn on b7 used to protect the a6 square because it got captured. Now it's on c6 and can no longer capture this pawn. So now simply we would get, let's say something like this, and we have a queen, and these 3 pawns are not going to become a new queen. Okay, another example of this is here. So here white is winning with the move g5. There's also the move f5, both work. So we'll look at g5 first. They work for pretty much the same reason. So g5 here, let's analyze takes first. If you take on g5, then after f takes on g5, then you'll see here we can play h6 afterwards, and h7 and h8. If you take, then we can take back. Let's say king a4. Here you can play h6. Obviously, we don't want white to be able to play h7. So if you take, we can simply take back, and there's no way to stop this pawn. So after let's say g5, let's say our opponent doesn't take. Let's say here they play the move king a4, simply just like waiting. Here if we take, then this is all blockaded, and black would probably be better because black, keep in mind, black does have the more active king here. But however, here we do have the move f5. So f5, it does look like there's 2 pawns that can be taken. However, here, if you play h takes on g5, the idea is simply playing f6. f6 is to kind of, this also kind of loops in deflection as well. Idea is if you take on f6, here we can play h6, h7, h8. And although black does get 4 pawns and this could look scary, these 4 pawns aren't the best. There are double pawns. There are double pawns here as well. And all 4 of these pawns are really weak, and they're not going to be able to survive. Accompanied with the king coming over to help support, they are all going to fall, and white is going to win. So going back here, so now, oops, sorry about that. So king a4, let's say f5. So here, if you take this way, e takes on f5, same thing, just mirror image. Here we can play g6 instead. If you take, there is no guard of the e6 square, we can simply push through. Similarly, black does have 4 pawns, but all 4 of these pawns are really vulnerable. And also going back to this position right here, if you ignore this pawn, let's say you play g4, then we can play f takes on g7, and we get a queen afterwards. And let's say you ignore this pawn, then you play g6 to not have to like take or deal with any of this, then there is h6 because this pawn has moved forwards. It's no longer controlling h6. And h7, h8, we are going to win the game by promoting a pawn. And going back here, the first move f5 leads to pretty much the exact same thing. Here, if you trade, then you'll see that we're able to push e6, e6, and then e7, e8, or takes in f8. If you take here, then we can simply take back. The king is too far to get in front of the pawn or stop this pawn in time, so this would be winning for white. So these are 2 examples of pawn breakthroughs where we sort of break through our enemy's lines in order to get a passed pawn through and get a new queen. And then finally, this one's a shorter example. Here for white, a6 is the only winning move. It looks counterintuitive because we want to play b6 to try to get a pawn through. And if you take here, then a6 looks really promising, but black's king does get back in time. And here, if you trade, then black does get back in time, and this could even be winning for black if white misplays. However, a6 here is the correct move, stopping black from being able to get to c6. So king to d6 to try to get back in time. Here we play the move b6, stopping king to c7. Here, obviously, so king to c6, wanting to get to this pawn. Here, the idea is b7, then maybe king c7, and this could be holding. However, here we can play b takes on a7, and there's no way to stop a8 equals queen. This a6 pawn stops king to b7, and the king is too far to get back in time to stop the pawn. And here, obviously, if you take, then now a7, and the king is too far. And finally, and I believe those are all, the possible variations. So white should be able to get a queen somehow on the b file or on the a file. So those are 3 examples of pawn breakthroughs, as well as sort of common themes and such in endgames. So now we'll split into breakout rooms to sort of practice pushing our passed pawns or getting basically one of our pawns to promote to become a queen. So I'll split you guys into breakout rooms now.